special focus is on public financing of health. And as you will see, the report, as is always the case, divided into two parts. The first part is the macroeconomic part, the state of the economy over the last several months. And then it delves into a particular topic, which is public financing of health this time around. So after I invite the country manager to speak, we will have I'll hand over to Solomon Serwanja, who will be the moderator throughout until 12:30 when we end. And he will tell us how that will go. So let me take this opportunity to invite Ms. Mukami Kariuki, who is the country manager for the World Bank here in Uganda. Mukami.
So good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to you, members of the media, distinguished discussants, and colleagues from the World Bank. I think we're very excited to have you here today. This is our first event at the new offices, so you are honored and we are honored, I should say, to have you here for this occasion. As you may be aware, this building was recently completed. We've been constructing it for over the last 4 to 5 years, I think, and discussing it for up to 20 years. And it's the first time that the bank is operating from its own premises in Uganda. So since we've been here since 1963, and we've just concluded our 60th year of engagement in Uganda, this building and the work that goes on within the walls is a firm signal that we are here to stay, and we'll be remaining engaged as Uganda's development partner for the foreseeable future on its journey towards socioeconomic transformation. So welcome to this office and welcome to this event. So I thank you all for joining this launch of the 23rd edition of the World Bank's flagship production in the country. It's called the Uganda Economic Update, or UEU. And as many of you know by now, these economic updates are released twice a year to provide an overview of recent economic developments, providing both an economic forecast for the medium term, but also addressing a topical issue that's pertinent to the current development priorities and agenda of the country. The aim of these updates is to inform policymakers, stakeholders, and the public, and stimulate debate around the topical issues by combining both country-specific analysis and global experience from our work across the world. As you will see in the presentation that follows, Uganda's economy is growing and is resilient despite having experienced multiple successive shocks. In fact, the medium-term outlook, even if a little fragile, looks positive. But to sustain the resilience and achieve inclusive growth, Uganda needs to manage its debt, strengthen revenue mobilization, improve public investment management, plan to manage oil revenues better, and invest more strongly in human capital development drivers such as health. Indeed, a focus on health is a key among the priorities Uganda's young and growing population will face. The country is prone to public health emergencies such as Ebola, yet its public spending on health is low and declining. At $6.8 per capita, the level of spending and investment in health is one of the lowest in the region, even while households and external development partners finance a combined 85% of total current health spending. That said, it's worth observing that although public spending on health is inadequate, it is relatively effective. Uganda's Universal Healthcare Service Coverage Index is similar to peer countries that spend more and equitable as well, in that lower level health facilities are accessible to both the rich and the poor. This is a gain that Uganda should expand on through policy reform that also targets enhanced investments in education and social protection to eventually reap a demographic dividend from its young and growing population. The World Bank encourages continued and robust discussion on the issue of public health financing. This is why the special topic for this 23rd edition of the Economic Update is improving public spending on health to build human capital. It is one of a series of deliberately chosen discussions with the human capital development theme. And indeed, it builds on and supports the 22nd edition of the update released in December 2022, which had a special focus on public financing for education. Maybe you may be aware that we're also working with government on a human capital review. So these elements all feed into that overall dialogue about human capital, which I think we'll hopefully be doing some work to launch later in the year. A key finding of the report is that the government of Uganda needs to increase its investment in health, education, and social protection to ensure its young people are both healthy and skilled enough to contribute to economic growth in an ever dynamic and changing world. This is essentially the demographic dividend we talk about. The World Bank produces reports such as the UEU, the Uganda Economic Update, to bring global knowledge and expertise to bear on country dialogue and to inform Uganda, enable debate, and allow decision makers to choose what works for the country. What we know from our experience and learning is that no country develops and transforms without quality human capital, i.e. its people, while physical capital, man-made goods, and natural capital, natural resources, are essential. Human capital, which is health, skills, abilities, and knowledge, are at the core and necessary for driving growth and harnessing a nation's potential. So I think for us, this is a fundamental pillar for development and one that we will continue to support the country on. So let me end by saying that we were planning to have some social media engagement later today, but due to some internet instability issues we had yesterday and other developments ongoing in the region, we have decided to opt for a safer way to make sure that we can capture the discussion and share it with the rest of the public. So we hope that we'll be able to do that successfully by the end of this day. And I think with that, let me say that I look forward to a future fruitful engagement with you today, to hearing questions and discussions adequately addressed by the discussants here today, and also to seeing what we collectively feel would be important issues to take forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mukami. Mukami is the World Bank country manager. Can we love on her again? Thank you very much, ma'am. A very good morning to you. Welcome to the World Bank, to the home of the World Bank. We congratulate the World Bank for getting a home. It's been a long journey, right? All right, welcome, karibu sana. We'll start this off by looking at the state of Uganda's economy, and this just comes after the Minister of Finance, Matia Kasaija, unveiled the budget just a few weeks ago, and all of us quietly followed. But this presentation, which is made by Rachel Sevu, the senior economist at the World Bank, really takes a deep dive into the state of our economy. We decided that we should record this presentation so that we can take it in without rushing. I would now love to invite our team, the technical team, to roll the presentation by Rachel that really gives us an outlook on how our economy is doing. Let's enjoy, let's note down a few things, and then later on we will engage at a deeper level. You're welcome.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you again for joining us this morning or this afternoon for us to launch the 23rd Uganda Economic Update. It is great to see you again as we launch this edition that is actually focusing on improving spending so that you can build human capital. As is our tradition, this edition also comes into parts. The first part is on the state of the economy, where we address look at the recent developments in the economy and provide an outlook. But also the second part that focuses on the special topic. I will do the first part, while my colleague Rogers will handle the second part of the presentation. In terms of highlights, I'll talk a little bit about the global developments and how that is affecting Uganda, look at the domestic policies and how that they have evolved, look at the overall growth outcomes and the outlook, as well as the impact on the households before we come to recommendations. In terms of the global economy, we know there are about 3 channels that can affect the economy. The first one is through prices, then we have the trade, then we also have the financial system. But as we have seen, commodity prices have been fluctuating, of course, for a number of factors, including way back from the Russian invasion on Ukraine, the Middle East crisis, as well as the other developments on the global economy that have affected prices. But overall, in the recent past, we've seen prices, much as they are volatile, they're actually stabilizing at a lower rate, and that has allowed inflation also to come down. As you can see in that chart, inflation has also been coming down, and that has allowed many or several monetary authorities around the world to start either easing or think of easing so that interest rates can come down and the financial markets can also begin to settle. And what that has done is actually to allow for a much positive developments at the global economy. And we see that growth is actually going to be around 2.6, which is a stabilization compared to 2.5 or 2.6 the previous year, 2023. And that stops or cuts the downward trend that we had seen. Maybe the second question then is, how does that affect the Ugandan economy? In terms of the effects, we can look through the external sector and look at what has happened to the balance of payments, what has happened to the current account. The most important development on the current account has been the fact that in addition to production domestically improving and also prices moving positively for some of Uganda's major export items, including coffee and gold, there has also been positive developments in terms of other flows like remittances, much as they are still below what we had at the time of COVID. And this has allowed the current account actually to stabilize. And we expect that the current account will be around 8.1 this financial year compared to 8.4 that it was the last financial year. Another important aspect is the fact that actually because of the positive developments on the export side, that has allowed, that has offset what is happening on the import side, because we know that imports are actually growing very fast to support the oil sector. Domestically, we see that monetary policy has actually remained quite tight, and that has allowed, because of the declining inflation, the real interest rates have actually been increasing. And that is not surprising that domestic credit has actually been slow and much as not declining, but growing at a much slower pace than what would have happened in the previous year. And credit, interestingly or unfortunately, is mainly going to personal and household loans, which means it's mainly supporting consumption, as well, while other items like manufacturing and trade and agriculture have not been getting as much credit as it should. And hence the conclusion that much as monetary and financial sector policies have actually managed the inflation. Inflation is so low, it has not really benefited the growth. Other aspects of the domestic policies relate to the fiscal agenda. On the fiscal side, by the end of the first half of the financial year, actually developments were quite positive because the fiscal deficit had come down to about 4.3, and that was well within the path that had been set by the Charter of Fiscal Responsibilities, which is great because it means that the debt dynamics were also improving, and that was auguring well for the fiscal consolidation agenda that government has set itself out to do. Maybe on a negative side is to note that revenues have not been working well, and they did not grow as much as they had been anticipated, hence the shortfalls in revenues. But on the expenditure side, there has been a lot of effort in terms of expenditure consolidation, but the negative part is that part of the expenditure shortfalls were actually on account of underspending, especially on the capital budget, and that does not augur well for growth. So in terms of looking outward, we expect that the end of financial year will actually would have worsened because there were additional expenditures in the second year that had been unanticipated because of, for example, the supplementaries that have been issued in the second part of the year, which increased spending well beyond what had been anticipated. So overall, for the entire financial year, the fiscal deficit is likely to be much higher than had been anticipated, and hence will not meet what had been anticipated under the Charter of Fiscal Responsibilities. Overall, on account of all those developments, what has actually happened to the real economy? First of all, looking at the first half of the year, growth had actually been sustained. But when you compare, for example, to the last financial year, which was 6.8% in the first half of the year, we see that there was actually a slowdown. So we have a growth rate of 5.4% in the first half up to the end of December, but that is positive, but much lower than what was seen in the previous financial year. Much of the activity was really supported by industry, thanks to the mining sector that is picking up quite strongly, but as well as the activities that is going on to support the oil sector. But on the other hand, the services were bumpy, as you can see in that picture, but and agriculture was actually very sluggish. So at the end of the period, that is why we have that level. Going into the second half of the financial year, we do not have the overall estimates of activities, but we do know that indicators such as the purchasing managers index provide some leading indicators as to what is happening in the economy. And this suggests that actually private investments have held strong, and despite all the shocks that have been faced. The PMI in particular has been positively growing for about 16 consecutive months and had just shown a slowdown in the month of February, but was again in the month of March, but was again on the upward trend in April and May, which suggests that actually private investments have actually been doing well into the second half of the year. Other indicators, like, for example, the Composite Index of Economic Activity that is published by Bank of Uganda, also suggests that economic activity was picking up in the second half of the year. However, there are other developments, like, for example, the currency depreciation that also came into, that also underpinned the tightening of monetary policy into the second half of the year, but also other development, like, for example, the traders' strike, all of which must have rattled business sentiments in the second half of the year. But all in all, we think that the oil-related activity held strong, and that overall growth is actually going to be at 6%. This is consistent with other entities that have provided, including government, that have provided an estimate for this financial year. And this means an acceleration when compared to the previous year, that where the economy was growing at 5.2%. In terms of impact on social welfare, we believe there has been some positive impacts, because actually consumption was improving and access to goods, so essential goods, was actually improving, according to the high frequency phone survey that Uganda Bureau of Statistics produces. But the coping mechanisms especially for the poor, are quite detrimental. Many of the coping mechanisms, like, for example, not doing anything or pulling out of school or not consuming the right foodstuffs, actually have implications to human capital development, which is not good in terms of development, overall development for the human being. Now moving on to the outlook for the economy. The outlook remains positive, as we see economic activity is actually going to be accelerating to about 6.2 in the financial year 24-25, to 6.6 thereafter, and maybe above 7% in the medium to long term. Inflation is expected to remain low, and exports are also expected to pick up about 8%, above 8%. And FDI is also to remain to really be strong, picking up from about 8.7 this financial year to over 10% in the next financial year. All these developments are mainly related to the developments in oil. So whatever happens in that sector is going to be very critical in terms of holding all these developments to as projected. In terms of the fiscal deficit, however, the fiscal consolidation that we have been seeing seems to have been suspended, because we see that the fiscal deficit is actually going to be increasing to 5% before it starts coming down again. And that is well above the target of the under the fiscal responsibility charter that had expected that this would be coming down to 3% by the end of this financial year. In line with the fiscal developments, of course, debt will also be increasing to above 50% starting next financial year. So given those developments, we can offer, in summary, about 5 key macro fiscal and structural reforms or recommendations that government should be undertaking in order to support a more inclusive growth agenda. The first one is actually to revert back to the fiscal consolidation agenda, because this will support a more prudent fiscal and debt management profile. It will also rebalance, for example, domestic financing away from domestic financing. It will ensure that there is no crowding out of the private sector development, and it will also reduce domestic arrears, reduce non-concessional financing of the deficit, and minimize all the fiscal risks that arise with high deficits. The second issue is to accelerate returns. accelerate reforms, including on the revenue mobilization agenda, but also on making sure that expenditures are more efficient by improving public investment management, and lastly, also to follow up on the public expenditure rationalization, but most importantly, to rebalance spending so that it can go to socio-economic development by improving spending on education, on health, and social protection. Then the third set of recommendation relates to actually, as we move into the oil era, there is need to improve and strengthen the incentive structures around the fiscal rules and the Charter of Fiscal Responsibility. For the second time round, we've had a fiscal responsibility charter that we've sort of abandoned towards the last 2 years. So as we move into oil management, we need to ensure that there are stronger rules that can support a faster, a sustainable, and inclusive growth by using these revenues as they come on board. The fourth one is also related to oil, is streamline the framework for managing the oil revenues. For example, the petroleum fund to manage excess oil revenue must have a clear, transparent framework for determining how much revenue to have, when to save it, and how reserves from the fund should be spent. In addition, the regulations underpinning the Petroleum Revenue Investment Reserve Fund, which is at the central bank, must be revised and to clarify its design and functions, to provide legal certainty, clarify roles and responsibilities, and transform it into a genuine sovereign wealth fund, which it is not now. And finally, to avoid the Dutch disease, of course, the country needs to ensure that it takes structural reforms that will enhance productivity, boost exports in the non-oil sector especially, while avoiding the overvaluation of the exchange rate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Quite extensive presentation. What captured my attention really was page 10, which really looks at, it summarizes the outlook and how the next financial year is going to look like. Some hope in the World Bank that the economy will grow at least by about 6.2%. And then in 2026, it will be about 6.6. I also note that the World Bank predicts that our public debt will increase from 48.8 to about 50.5. And in the financial year 2026, will be about 51.9. Currently, our public debt stands at about 93 trillion. I think the last time I checked, those are the numbers that were coming from the Minister for Finance, Matia Kasaija, with about 55 trillion in external debt, and the rest of it is domestic. But I also noted in Rachel's presentation that debt management will be very, very critical in growing the economy. When we're talking about the economy, to really simplify it to the common man is, where do we get money? How do we spend it in the right way? And how can we grow? I think to summarize it, Rachel. And we want to put some context to Rachel's presentation. And so I would love to invite Rachel, the author of the report herself. Rachel Karibu, please come and have a seat. Rachel Sevude is a senior economist at the World Bank. I also want to invite Mr. Joseph Enyim, who is the Commissioner, Economic Development Policy and Research at the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. We also want to invite Dr. Kenneth Mugambe, CEO at Global Power Services Limited. He's also former Director Budget at the Ministry of Finance. I'd love to invite you, please, to take your seats here. Yet you authored this report. Let me just start with you. And I know you tried to elaborate what did we do right and what did we do wrong. Just put it simply. What did we get right in the concluding financial year? Simply put, Rachel.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience that is here. The previous financial year has been tough. Like all economies, Uganda has also been facing a lot of challenges. So much of what I can say in summary, what has been done well, is actually for Uganda to be able to manage those shocks. Like, for example, there has been a lot of pressure on prices going up. Prices have been coming up and down, but and in other countries, the inflation has been much higher. But in Uganda, the country the authorities managed to manage that so that we didn't get into high inflation. The other part is also the fact that the government and the private sector in general has been able to support this oil side, the developments around oil, to allow the environment for the private investors to continue with the activities that are going on in the oil sector, because that has been a major driver as well of what has happened in terms of the outcome on growth. The other aspect is on the positive one. The other aspect is in general, the private sector has remained very positive about this country. In spite of the many challenges and shocks, I think they've held strong, as we saw in the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, that actually there has been a lot of positivity around the economy. And given the challenges that we point out, credit is not working that well, and other shocks, I think we give it credit, the private sector itself, that it has been able to hold strong and to make sure that the economy keeps moving.
Yeah, just reflecting from what you're saying, private sector credit just grew by about 1 trillion, from just 20 trillion to about 21 trillion. And while they have really tried to stay afloat amidst all the challenges, which is good, and we all believe that this economy will grow with the private sector. I think last time we talked, Rachel, you were emphasizing that. Thanks, Rachel. Joseph, maybe let me just start with Dr. Kenneth. What did we get right? You were in that seat before, and now you are in the private sector world. What did we get right? What did we get wrong?
Okay, so thank you, Solomon. Of course, as you know, I've been off the scene for 3 years now. So now I speak like an ordinary person, not like Joseph. So whatever I say is, by and large, supposed to reflect, what the thinking of the ordinary person is, because that's what I am. I fully concur in terms of what has been got right. I actually concur with, of course, what has been presented and what Rachel actually highlighted. It's clear if you look at, the 6% rate of growth, that's a double of what we had last year. And then, of course, it takes us back actually to the pre-COVID. So meaning we are actually now over the COVID, excuse if you want. So there's no reason now we should keep talking about COVID, because we have now achieved, the pre-COVID, growth rate, which is 6%. Because if you look at financial year, I think 18-19, we grew at around 6%. Then, of course, after that, we declined because of COVID. So in terms of the overall macro, I think as a country we are doing well because, we have, gone back on the, growth trajectory. And of course, credit must be given, to particularly Ministry of Finance and overall, the country. There are a number of things, of course, that come out, which again, I think Rachel pointed towards. When you look at the private sector in Uganda, it is quite resilient and vibrant. And I think credit must be given to the reforms which we did. It cannot be for any other reason, but the reforms that were undertaken, the market-oriented reforms, which actually gave, the private sector that space to be able to innovate and also be able to invest. So in all these instances, you definitely see, a resilient, vibrant, private sector. Then, of course, the question of the investments in oil. I mean, where we are now, there's a lot of capital inflow, on account of the stage at which we are on the move towards, oil production. This is actually the stage where all these investments are happening. I mean, you see a lot of things, work on the ECOP. I know Kabarega Airport in Hoima is almost done. There are discussions on the refinery. So definitely there is, quite a positive, positive developments that are happening. So definitely the whole sum effects of that, the developments in the oil industry, what is happening in the private sector, definitely must be contributing to the growth rates that we are seeing. And then, of course, one other important good point maybe is the fact that the three key sectors of the economy, again, are growing. If you look at agriculture, of course, agriculture in many cases lags behind, but at least we have seen agriculture now recovering. We have seen industry. We have seen services. But of course, as we move on, you also realize that normally the devil is in the detail. I don't want to spoil the party, but the devil is in the detail. So, and actually, one of the criticisms I had going forward, maybe one thing which the World Bank and the government needs to do is, to go a little bit deeper. Okay, the macro. Let me give you a local analogy coming from our part of the world. If you go and see cow dung, there's a tendency for cow dung to be dry on the surface, but try to step on it. I'm sure Kamagambe knows. You step on it and you see what will happen. You see, when you sit on the surface, it's like hard. But the moment you step on it, it is actually very soft, and you actually do what? You will sink in it. So normally the devil is in the detail. So it is always good to go deeper, dive deep, and see, what is happening. And I think that's part of this discussion that we are going to have.
Yeah.
So I want to stop at that for now.
And we'll get there. The devil is in the detail. I think what you're trying to point at is public investment management. Rachel hinted about it, but I'll scratch you a little bit more as we continue. Kenneth, thank you very much for that. Joseph, what did we get right? What did you get wrong?
Well, thank you. And World Bank, we appreciate the opportunity to participate in this dialogue. I bring you apologies from PSST, who's not able to be here because of another equally high level event. What did we get right? I will start with policy coordination. I think that we've seen a very coordinated action between the fiscal and monetary authorities in the last 2 to 3 years as a part of the overall economic management response to the post-COVID-19 economic impacts. And that is evident, of course, in the way inflation has played out, but also the way that the exchange rate has been relatively stable. And that is important, which leads me to the next point. That broadly, Uganda has been able to sustain investor confidence. Investors look at those policy signals and the government's ability and commitment to its business environment. And they read into that. And of course, the numbers tell it. The fact that we emerged the leading FDI destination in East Africa, recently, and also the fact that we were, voted the best investment destination in Africa just a few weeks ago. What else did we get right? Government's consistency, like has been said, in terms of bringing to fruition investments in oil and gas is very important, because the return to investment, a lot of infrastructure investments have been undertaken. Roads, whether energy, legal and institutional developments, to make sure that that sector eventually delivers. The other thing that I would say has gone well, and which is not very evident on the surface, is, I call it inclusive, the inclusive policies of government. We have significantly repurposed the budget in the last 2 to 3 years. And that has given a boost to final household consumption. If you look at the numbers, I think for the first 2 quarters of financial year 23-24, relative to the previous year, we see about a 15% increase in final consumer expenditure. And, programs such as the PDM, and other rural or grassroots-based initiatives of government are helping to sustain demand for the retail segment in the economy. You saw the results from the study conducted by UMA regarding issues of plant utilization rates, and you could see those that are engaged in the chains of fast-moving consumer goods being able to sustain some levels of manufacturing. I also want to credit the actions of government in terms of fiscal consolidation. It's not very obvious when you look at the aggregate numbers as has been presented, but within the overall fiscal deficit, there has been a lot of shifting between the composition of government's budget. So in terms of allocative efficiency of the budget, I want to submit that that has gone also well. If you talk about why, again, investor confidence, I would say that government has also had a good handle on security and peace, and that's, of course, very important for the investment climate. And then lastly, I would say we've had an uptick in tourism inflows, and the investments we've plugged into Uganda Airlines, the renovation of the airports, and just aggressive marketing of the country as a tourism destination are yielding in terms of returning inflows to pre-COVID levels. And we also see that in terms of private remittances into the economy, as has already been explained. Those have really helped offset the deficit in the overall scheme of the external sector. So that's what I can say for now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Joseph. I think that the Minister of Finance, indeed, and the Bank of Uganda, you mentioned about managing the exchange rate and inflation. I think it's very core. Where I'll slightly disagree with you is budget allocation efficiency, but we'll come to that, especially even after the president has refused to sign the finance bill. He has sent it back to parliament saying that there were some reallocations in there that he didn't understand, but we'll see if that can work out. Rachel, I just wanted us to break this conversation into detail. And I think that Kenneth said the devil is in the detail. Let's cluster this next phase in terms of money. Where is government getting money? And you rightly mentioned about debt. We're getting money from borrowing. We're getting money from foreign direct investments, and everyone has talked about it here. We're getting money from revenue collection. So that we can be able to then talk about the expenditure of this money and then the return on that investment. So that's how I would love to block it. Rachel, you're worried about Uganda's public debt. In fact, you are projecting on page 10 again, if I am to go back to that page, you're projecting that our public debt will rise to about 50.5 from 48.5, that's debt to GDP. And you've talked about debt management. Should be very careful with it. What did you mean?
Thank you, Solomon. The debt is like an egg, or we have a situation of an egg and a chicken and egg situation. That's what they call it. Because yourself, you've also mentioned the sources of funding. The most important source of funding for a country for development is actually its own revenue. And a lot of effort has been put into that already. There is a domestic revenue mobilization strategy that government is trying to pursue. We've been seeing a lot of effort in terms of even upgrading or moving into technology to try to improve efficiency of collecting revenue. By failing to actually get to the targets that we have set, that itself creates a situation of where else do you go? Then you have to borrow. So long as we don't collect enough revenues, then we still have a challenge. And the best solution actually to the debt problem is that we can get enough of our own revenues, because not so many entities out there are still giving free money like grants. Of course, the World Bank has some windows of grants, and a few external partners are providing grants, but those numbers are reducing. So the first point of action, if we are worried about debt, is what do we do to the revenue? The average of 13%, maybe we are now moving to 14, and so on. Even if we move to 15, say in 1 year, is still among the lowest. We are not even near the average for sub-Saharan Africa, which is about 18%. So it means that we by not doing the revenue part, we are actually shooting ourselves in the foot, and we have to rely on debt to be able to support the country to develop and grow. And if we then move to the other side, okay, revenues might not solve all the problems, then let's go out. The next financing item, it has to be a certain type of debt. But even when you are borrowing, what you borrow, the terms you are borrowing at, and also determine how bad or good or comfortable you are going to be when you are paying back the debt. We normally talk about concessional borrowing, and not to brag for the institution, but some entities, the multilateral institutions like the World Bank offer, and African Development Bank, offer concessional borrowing, which allows you to take on the money, not pay interest, and pay over a much longer period of time, compared to some of the other sources of funding, which are referred to as non-concessional, that are first of all high interest, and are going to make your debt management aspects very uncomfortable, because you have to first of all pay in a very short time, but also pay at a very high level of that debt. So that's what we mean, that we need to actually be able to manage our debt properly. But that issue of debt management starts from how do we raise our revenue effort? Of course, when you talk about revenue, there are a lot of insensitivities, and I think the most critical one is the fact a small part of the economy is being taxed, and that part is actually feeling the pain. Whenever there is additional effort to raise, to be able to collect, it is that small part that is still feeling the pain, that we are paying, we are overtaxed, and so on and so forth. So the challenge is, how do we make sure that we can actually expand the tax base and level the burden, so that it's not only on a small part of the population that are paying this that are contributing to the raising the revenue. Let me stop there.
Yeah, and again, the revenue comes from the private sector. I think, Ken, you very rightly, now that you're in the private sector, you exactly know what I'm talking about. So this financial year, we're going to be getting about what, 9 trillion in terms of domestic debt. We're going to be getting money from the domestic market, from largely commercial banks. And I remember reading something last financial year of Matia Kasaija saying, okay, commercial banks come. And that has an effect on crowding out the private sector, because anyway, there is no money to give. Government is more secure to get these papers, government papers, because you'll be paid back. Dr. Kenneth, it's a delicate balance. Government needs money. One of the options is really to go to the domestic market and get money. But in a way, it affects the private sector. And yet, there's a mission to have a private sector-led economic growth. How do we find that thin line? And Rachel is saying you have to get money, raise revenue domestically by empowering the private sector, but then you also come and compete with the private sector. How do we manage that?
Okay, actually, I thought I would comment first on the overall question of financing the budget, because I think that's where the problem starts. Whether it is to be funded from debt or whether to be funded from domestic revenue, because actually that is, in the first instance, the question that must be addressed. Now, if you look at, and I think that's the dilemma which the government has, the challenge actually that the government has, and of course the options are very limited. Now, if you look at particularly the next financial year's budget, I definitely see a problem. If you look at domestic debt, government is projecting domestic revenue. Government is projecting, I think, about 32 trillion, if I remember well, of domestic revenue. Now, if you compare that against probably the projected outturn for this year, remember this year, I think the projection was 29. The projection was 29, the current year. The minister pronounced a performance of about 27. Yeah. If you allow for additional correction between the remaining few days and weeks of the financial year, and you give a benefit of the doubt, you can assume that it would be about 28 trillion for argument's sake. So that is an increase of 4 trillion between the performance of this year and the projection for next financial year. Now, if you translate that into GDP terms, remember our GDP, as pronounced by the minister, is about 200 trillion. So 4 trillion as a percentage of 200 trillion is about 2 percentage points. 2 percentage points of GDP. Now, if you look at all the historical, numbers, the only year when Uganda was able to register that big increase in revenue was around 2016, 2017, when we had a 1% increase of GDP in revenue. For the rest of the years, it is around 0.5%, half a percentage point. So you are starting on a very, very shaky ground to assume that you are going to get a two percentage points, which you have never achieved in the history of URA. So already the projection for revenue itself is actually a challenge. So the challenge, the point I want to make, the challenge is actually not even what you are projecting even to borrow from the market alone, but already the domestic revenue projection is a problem. So most likely, what would actually happen is that government would actually resort, of course, unless expenditure is cut. But if you have sustained the expenditure, as presented in the budget, it means actually government is likely, to borrow more than actually what you are seeing, the 9 trillion you are saying. So the impact on the private sector actually is likely even to be much higher than what you are thinking. So as I said, of course, it seems like it is between a stone and a hard place. So the options are limited. And we all definitely know, if you look at the performance of the commercial banks over the last year or so, I think except for Equity Bank, practically all banks made profit. Okay? And of course, they are making profit not because they are lending to the private sector. They are making profit because they are investing in government paper. And I wouldn't blame them, actually. If I'm in that space, what I would actually do is to buy government paper and actually sit back and, relax. So the question now, of course, is, what are the options for the government? Of course, one option would be to cut, expenditure. But already you are starting from a very high, projection, 72 trillion, as we know. Okay? So 72 trillion. So what options do you have, to cut that expenditure? And if you're going to cut expenditure, what is going to be the impact? Joseph earlier talked about, the repurposing of the budget, the fiscal consolidation. But again, if you go deeper, you actually discover that actually there's no repurposing of the budget. Because if you provide the high levels of supplementary as we are seeing, okay, this year, based on the numbers I've seen, supplementary is about 20%. 20% of the budget. It's the highest that has ever happened. Over the last couple of years, it has been hovering between 10 to 15%. Again, the highest. So if you are financing the budget through that avenue of supplementary, of course, the question is, where is the money going? But again, if you go deep in the allocations and in the performance of the sectors, you actually discover that a number of sectors are actually, accumulating areas. If you go to road development, UNRWA in particular, as we speak now, they have areas of 1 trillion. Areas of 1 trillion before this financial year, actually. So if you add the challenges arising out of probably this financial year, plus what I have seen in the budget, because when you look at the budget of next year, road development has been cut by almost $500 billion. So for me, actually, I wouldn't look at that, as repurposing. What is happening is that you are really, for lack of a better word, buying time. But at the end of the day, the problem is actually not going away. Because at some point, as long as you do not stop, for example, the road contracts, because you have actually contracted these roads, okay? So the contractors are probably, on the ground, implementing the roads. But what you are doing, you are not releasing money to UNRWA, but you are accumulating areas on the one hand. And where are you transferring the money? That's a debate for another day. Yeah. So I think that is the challenge that the government is facing. I mean, I wouldn't want to say that I have a solution. As I said, it is between a rock and a hard place. But at the bottom line, of course, is those are the hard questions that the government must, address. Because if you continue on that route, if you continue on the route, for example, of the 72 trillion budget, with the kind of challenges we are seeing in the revenue projections, because what magic are you going to have, actually, as I said, to be able to raise domestic revenue by 2 percentage points of GDP, which has never happened in the history of Uganda? So what measures, what interventions are you actually putting in place? Yes, of course, Rachel talked about broadening the tax base. In the short term, what kind of magic are you going to have to broaden the tax base to be able to achieve that kind of revenue. It's a problem. Of course, one of the things maybe which can be done. Last evening, I was listening to, these days of social media, people said all sorts of things. So there was this discussion between some young lady from the Revenue Authority who was quoting a business lady, and she was explaining how the business lady didn't file her returns well, and the business lady was saying, okay, you come and actually do it for me. So what I will actually do, I don't know how many people had that thing. It was quite intriguing. So she said, okay, what I will do, good enough, I still have enough stock. Come, we value the stock, I'll pay you your revenue, okay? But then, of course, what happens means I will actually get out of the business. So yes, as we talk about broadening the tax base, what options are there? Maybe the simple option would be to try and plug the leakages that are happening. Because now, again, speaking as a person on the street, we hear, of course, that there are still leakages, of course. I think that's one immediate, option that can actually happen if one can actually, plug those loopholes in the URA revenue collection system. At least those would actually boost the revenues. But in the absence of that, the short-term measures are really not many. And I think the bottom line is actually cutting public expenditure, but of course without impacting on the core services. And I think that point has actually come out very clearly in the presentation by the World Bank. Because if you cut public expenditure, but actually what you are affecting is agriculture. If you look at the projections for the budget for next year, agro-industrialization is actually going down. Of course, you can actually reduce it on the assumption that the money is going to PDM. But it's actually PDM delivering agriculture that the ordinary person wants. When you go on the ground, you get the sense that people have extension services. When you go on the ground, you get the sense that there is government intervention to address pests and diseases. I mean, if you think of a couple of months back, in the cattle corridor, there was an outbreak of FMD. Were there vaccines for FMD? From what I know, the FMD vaccines came like a month ago. But the FMD actually was about 6 months ago. So if you repurpose the budget, but you are not actually addressing the core challenges, because again, this is a very good discussion about GDP. You see, at the bottom line of GDP and growth is how does the ordinary person actually feel? Yeah. How does this GDP translate into money? For the ordinary person. GDP does not translate into money for the ordinary. It does, but depending on where the GDP is actually. If you do, as we have actually seen, if GDP is driven by investments in oil and gas, as it is to some extent now, essentially what's happening is because you have actually imported a huge pipeline for ECOP. When you import a huge pipeline for ECOP of $1 billion, definitely that is increase in the GDP for Uganda. But does that translate into money for an ordinary guy? It definitely does not in the short term. What translates into money in the short term is when you see GDP growing in agriculture. Because when GDP grows in agriculture, then probably it means that a guy in Achori who is growing simsim, his production has increased. And of course, if he's selling simsim, it will translate into money. A guy in Kamwenge who is doing maize, or a guy in Chiruhura who is doing milk, or in Rwampara who is doing matoke, is actually feeling the impact. So you need to have, a broader picture of actually this discussion of GDP and how it impacts, on the ordinary person, and see, if the ordinary person is going to benefit or is benefiting, how is he benefiting and in which sectors do you want to put the money? And that's why it is actually a good discussion, because it starts from, the good numbers of GDP. But of course, as you go down and then you relate it to the budget, are we putting the money in those areas actually that will help, not only sustain the growth in the economy, but actually that will help to put money in people's pockets? Because the common person on the street, what is interested in is really money in the pocket.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Thanks a lot. I was just trying to relate what you're saying. Development budget has continued to reduce, certainly. And we'll be talking about where we're putting money. Are we putting money in the right places? But we have Joseph here, who directly is the Commissioner for Economic Development. You increased the budget to 72 trillion. Where are you going to get that money from? Rachel is saying, look, you have to grow the private sector to collect good revenue. You have to manage your debt. But you have shot it up from 52 to 72. And Rachel is predicting that you're going to borrow more to be able to sustain that expenditure. Kenneth is saying, look, literally saying, are we really serious with what we are talking about? Especially that he was in a privileged position just a couple of years back. What's going on? Simply put.
All right. Thank you very much. I think it's important to recalibrate the discussion we are having. Kenneth and Rachel have talked about some first-time milestones in the fiscal landscape of Uganda. And there is always a first in life. So I want to turn that around and say the firsts that are happening are not just on the fiscal side of the economy. We are also having some firsts in other sides of the economy. For example, in the calendar year 2023, if you look at the records from ERA and Umeme's power consumption records, you will notice that for the first time in Uganda, we are seeing industrial power consumption in 1 year rising by 100 megawatts. That is the first time in our economy. What is driving that level of demand for power? It means if you were not foresighted to have front-loaded the capacity to generate and respond to demand by the industrial sector, we would be very, very likely headed now for another repeat of blackouts. If you're having demand for electricity growing at 10% per annum, it means that if you just sustained things business as usual currently, in less than 10 years, Uganda will not have enough electricity to sustain its manufacturing agenda. And so, whereas we are talking about the levels of debt, you must be able to contextualize that into what is the economy we are building for 10 years from today. We are not building the current economy, and you have to prepare yourself for that. Now, we are talking about crowding out money from the private sector. I would see it otherwise. Yes, the commercial banks are lending to government. But when they lend that money to government, what is government doing with it? Could we have been able to capitalize UDB to the level we have done? Could we have been able to push the amount of money we have pushed into the rural households at the rate we have done without this reorganization of the budget? So if you go to the commercial banks, for example, their appetite to lend to the agricultural sector is very low. It's a high-risk sector. So government cannot sit back and allow the commercial banking system to determine credit allocation fully in the economy. It has to be able to look at the strategic sectors of the economy. And if it means moving money out of that commercial segment, move it to the development finance landscape and channel that money to build the economy you are aspiring to have, so be it. I think that is prudent economic management, because that's where your jobs are going to come from. That's where your taxes are going to come from. And so we are talking about fasts. It is the first time Uganda is delivering over $3 billion inflowing into the country as FDI. That is a first. What is that FDI going to do? It is going to make sure you have goods to export. It's going to make sure you have jobs. If you look at the turnout of URA's numbers, this financial year we're talking about, the best performing tax head is Payee, with a surplus of close to 400 billion shillings. What is behind that surplus? Yes, partly an increase in the pay to government scientists and the rest, but also a significant part is coming from activities in the oil and gas sector. It's coming from the private sector recruiting. That is not possible if the private sector is not investing. And so I would like us to be able to not be short-sighted, because the future that we are building, you cannot manage it on the basis of how the current state of your economy looks like. And I will want to delve deeper into this, maybe when we go into the next segment. There is concern as to whether we are rebalancing the budget properly. Are we investing enough in the social sectors? But we have to look at what drives sustainability in a government's capacity to sustain social spending. And
Okay.
that's a conversation we can have.
It's interesting what you just said when you're speaking. When you're speaking about that, well, it's good that we're producing more power and that there are more, industries being constructed. And again, it goes back to the private sector. But, you're putting money in the parish development model. You are putting 50 billion in the presidential initiative on bananas. They're really thinking, what's the return on that investment? I mean, when you look at the exports, according to the numbers that and the data that was presented by the Honorable Matia Kasaje, our biggest export is what? Gold. And then we have coffee. But then on the other side, there's cement. There's what? Beer.
Yeah, but may I just add on that? For the first time, I think coffee exports are hitting $1 billion. Who produces that coffee? These are regular households. Milk exports last year hit $230 million plus. We've never exported grain and beans to the extent we did in the last, in this calendar fiscal year we are closing. So it's important to understand, even by the composition of our exports. Yes, gold is a big player there, but in terms of, moving in households, it may not do it at a rate that these other value chains are doing. So I would like us to take that into account, that the margin for the export farms is about 10 to 15%. So if your export of $1 billion of coffee is finding its way into the pockets of regular households, I think that you can counter that with the environment that is facilitating that, if you have to invest in that environment to support that. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, yeah, and then we'll do just one more round, and then we'll open up to the members of the media to ask at least 3 questions, and then we have another presentation next.
I think
yes.
the issue of coffee is actually a good one, because definitely coffee will put money in the pockets of people. And it's one of those areas where I think government got it right in terms of investment. But if you simply looking at, the big jump in coffee earnings now, what you need to remember, this is on account of the investments which government did many years ago. Many years, 10 years down the road, government did, when we had this replanting, providing free seedlings and all those things. So people tend to forget, actually, that the benefits we are reaping from coffee is because of that deliberate policy action that government does. So now the big question I think we need to ask ourselves is, going forward, okay, under the current trajectory, okay, are we likely to sustain, that growth in coffee exports actually without commensurate investments in coffee? Or maybe put it the other way around, are the investments now, okay, sufficient, in coffee, in agriculture in particular, I mean generally, are they sufficient actually to sustain that kind of level of growth of actually coffee? Because, so for me, that is actually a very good example of a deliberate government policy. So if actually a government makes a deliberate decision and identifies some of those, strategic, critical, interventions, definitely down the road you reap the benefits. But are we sustaining that? I think for me that is really the question that one needs to ask.
All right, thanks, Kenneth. Rachel, let me just come to you. Really short answers, like a minute or two, and then we can open it up to the members of the fourth estate. In your report, you talk about public finance management as being very critical moving forward. So, public finance investment, and where are we spending the money? So we've talked about revenue collection. We're now going to spending the money. How should we spend this money so that there is return on that investment? Yes, you're welcome, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've been emphasizing the issue of public investment management forever, because it's critical. Even if we are looking ahead and we are putting all the investments we have, in things we are going to realize ahead, we will not get them unless we put the resources in the right projects, manage them properly, and make sure that we get the return. So it is just emphasizing what we've been saying before, that let's identify the areas we want to invest in, identify the right projects, select them carefully so that they are the best options that we have as a country, and then manage them properly so that we can get the return. Because we are, summarizing, so that's what I can say on that issue. But on the revenue, one other quick one that may be short to medium-term measure that we can look at, apart from expanding, there is this issue of tax expenditures, and it is, one of the areas of leakages that I know we want to promote investments, but it's also an issue that needs to be looked at very, very well to make sure that we actually do not allow the revenues that are supposed to be collected, instead of leaking them to investors, some of whom do not actually need them. But maybe as a last word, the good macros that we are seeing are also on account of the prudent management of the policies, both the fiscal and the monetary in particular. But as we have mentioned in the presentation and also in the report, it looks like the instruments we try to put in place to guide us are also not very binding. And this is the Charter of Fiscal Responsibility. For the second time, we did a charter. And it looks like we are not anywhere, because the target was actually to get to 3%. I know there are some shocks and whatever, but this time around, the shock is actually just a boost in expenditures that is now throwing us completely off track. So as Kenneth was saying, we need to look at expenditures and probably cut our cloth according to how much we can eat, because by just raising expenditures, we are also shooting ourselves in the foot, and we are throwing away the fundamental. It is very easy to lose this balance, and you get back to the to instability. So going back and thinking through what incentive frameworks, what fiscal rules, and this is going to be very critical, especially when the oil comes, because we don't want to just spend, at the end of the day, to just create more instability, and the private sector won't function. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Rachel, you talked about expenditure. Kenneth, let me just bring you in here. How we spend our money is one of the things that, in my view, and I heard you say that earlier, something that we need to pay attention to. For example, Parliament is receiving 900 billion this financial year. Think about that for a second. and just try to get down to where this money is going, we just bought two Mercedes Benzes at 2.6 billion. We just realized that 500 million shillings went to fencing the Speaker's house in Bukedia with electric fencing. We realized about money, it's just funny what's coming out. If many of you have been following what's going on, the corruption that the president has spoken about openly at the State of the Nation, where we're spending our money, yes, you will deepen the taxes. People collect taxes, we'll get debts, we'll get that. Rachel talked about the public investment management. But we're also talking about that the devil is in the detail in terms of our expenditure. I just wanted you to broaden it a little bit there.
Solomon, you know, I left government and I want peace. I'm enjoying my peace, so don't drag me into your problems. Now, I think of course, you're asking genuine questions. And these are really the hard questions which we need to answer. So the first question is, as you said, what is the composition of this expenditure? Okay? And normally, the biggest problem is actually being able to strike, the right balance between the revenue, your revenue sources, and your expenditure. Now, the impression I get now, which is to me worrying actually as an ordinary citizen and as a taxpayer, it seems to me as if expenditure is the one driving revenue. That's what it seems to me. Just like you said, when you see the jump, in the expenditure, and then the question, of course, you want to ask yourself, if you have this 72 trillion, is the 72 trillion actually reflecting the actual priorities that you want, as a country? Because that's the detail I'm actually talking about. So once, you decompose the 72 trillion and you find out where the 72 trillion, let's assume actually the balance is there between the revenue, if you have the right, revenue sources which can generate, the domestic revenue and the external revenue to finance the expenditure. The question is the 72 allocated the right priorities? And I'll go back to the issue I raised earlier on. I mean, when you look at allocation in some of the critical sectors, doesn't seem to be the case for me. Because if I see agriculture, where 60 to 70% of the population actually derive their livelihood, when you see allocation going down, I don't get the impression that actually the right balance in terms of prioritization is actually being made. If you see road development going down, yeah, of course you can make the case that yes, we have reached, like some kind of equilibrium in terms of, having sufficient kilometers of roads. But of course, the question is, are you putting sufficient money in maintenance of this infrastructure? Because actually, if you develop the roads, you can borrow from the World Bank, okay, and set up these nice roads as we see. But of course, going forward, you need to ensure that you strike a good balance between the infrastructure you're creating and of course the maintenance of that infrastructure. Short of that, actually, you'll pay more in the long run, actually, once, the roads need the complete overhaul and the, rehabilitation. So to answer your question, I think the question for all of us, particularly for, the citizens, is to have, an a bird's eye view of the budget of the 72 trillion of Honorable Kasaija, my boss, and make a case whether that 72 trillion actually reflects, the priorities that we want. The other day, I was reading in the papers, when you're out there, your major source of information is actually the media. So at times you don't even know whether the information is right or not. So you will excuse me. Sometime back, me and there is a lady here called Barbara Magezi, my sister actually. We used to work on a program called Open Data something. Open Data. It seems the World Bank abandoned it because that was supposed to be a program to help an ordinary person access, information wherever you are. So when you look at, so there was information which came out when they did the midterm evaluation of the NDP, the third NDP. I think based on the midterm evaluation, the NDP was achieving only 17% of the targets. Doesn't that point to a lack of alignment or misalignment between the allocation of resources and the NDP? Because if the NDP is your main instrument, to achieve all these objectives, growth objectives that we're talking about, and yet you're only achieving 17%, of the targets, are you actually, allocating the resources properly? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. And as I said, I do not necessarily have the answers. But I mean, looking at some of those things, they don't point to, a proper prioritization of these resources.
Okay,
Thanks
a lot. You have the final say, Joseph, on expenditure. There are so many questions that have been coming in terms of, we get all this money, and I know that I've had conversations with the PS, Ramadan Gobi, the Deputy PS, Ochaila, Patrick. Now I'm here with you, and I've always had one question: does the Minister of Finance pay attention to the expenditure, and does it meet our NDP, which is our driving paper to where we want to be, into a middle-income state? I hope we'll have that conversation later. But in terms of expenditure, are you confident about our expenditure? Joseph.
Thank you. I'm very glad that we are having this conversation in the confines of the World Bank here. Why? Because they are a knowledge authority. They can tell you a lot about the outcomes of Uganda's development. So in the long term or medium term scheme of things, the way you know whether your expenditure is addressing the right priorities is by looking at your development outcomes. Yes. So the question we need to be asking ourselves is, are Uganda's development outcomes headed in the right direction? If so, that cannot be an accident. It means that the strategic agenda of government, by and large, is delivering. Time may not allow us to go into this. I'm very happy that recently we had the release of the Uganda Demographic Health Survey, where you can see the direction of our social indicators. Today we are getting the new, preliminary population numbers, and they will tell us a lot about how the country is performing. But let's move closer to the short term, since we're talking about the budget. We all agree that a nation's greatest asset are its people. And when we talk about where are we putting the money, first of all, before I address that, I very quickly want to go back to your issue of financing and observe that Ugandans, to a large extent, are the ones financing this budget. Over 85% of the money for next year's budget is coming from domestic financing. About 40% of that is coming from, taxes, from revenue, and the other 40 or so, of course, is, domestic borrowing. So it will be Ugandans paying that same money. Now the issue is that about 7 to 8 trillion, the money we are going to pay back to BOU, that money in essence is not money we are going to spend. That is money we have spent, And the agreement is that BOU will be using the instruments we are issuing them for conduct of its monetary policy, as and when they want to achieve their monetary policy objectives. They will release that paper in the market in, at a pace and a composition that is consistent with what we are trying to achieve. So coming back to your question of where are we spending this money? Number one, the Human Capital Development Program is attracting the largest share of the budget. That you are aware of. The other big player in the budget is, of course, governance and security. And like I told you earlier, there are many factors that go into sustaining investor confidence. And that is not an area as a country that we can afford to underinvest in or mismanage. We have a lot of money going into private sector development. We still see from the private sector that besides wages, the other largest cost driver for the private sector is energy and transport. And so if we are going to stay competitive as an economy, we have to sustain our infrastructure stock and maintain the same, really, to stay competitive. And so it is not adequate for us to say little money is going into agriculture. Agriculture benefits from energy, from transport, from financing. So it will not be a complete story if you just look at the money that goes into the program per se.
Okay.
But you have to look at that dynamic.
Comprehensively. Joseph, there are some questions from journalists, so thank you very much. Oh, Richard, you wanted to say something real quick. Okay.
Yeah, on the expenditure, I'm glad that Joseph brought out the issue that the greatest asset for a country is its people. But our numbers have been showing that actually investment into the human, spending on health, spending on education, has been coming down. So much as there has been increases over the last 1 or 2 years, we also have to take into account how much this increase is, to what extent is it contributing, because we know every year we get an additional, the birth rate is what, maybe 600 to 1 million people. So joining the education sector, joining the health sector. So coming back to the detail that we are talking about, what we do at the bank is that we look into some of these aspects. And I hope the next discussion is going to highlight what we mean but when we say that we're not actually spending enough on the human being, and that is going to be detrimental. Because you can have your physical capital, but if you don't have the human capital, then you are not actually developing.
All right, thanks. Under 30 seconds.
You're actually adding on the same point she's making. Because I think the critical point is not simply to look at the nominal allocation per se. Because actually nominally, yes, human capital development would be having position number 1 in terms of allocations. But the question is that money actually sufficient to address the concerns in human capital and actually be able to develop the quality of the human resource that you want? Now, when you are confronted with a situation of 50% dropout rate, for example, in education, when you take the children who start primary education now, by the time they finish P7, 50% have actually dropped out. So it actually means you need to invest a lot more. And of course, how do you invest in a lot more? Best by addressing maybe the inefficiencies. Maybe where you are putting the money in other sectors, you need to put out some of those resources and put more. It is a delicate balance, but definitely looking at the nominal figure per se might not necessarily address the question.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm sure Joseph want to say, I want to add, I want to do a +1. A round of applause to my panelists, please. I have to ask your attention to Rogers' presentation, after which we will have a short panel discussion. The technical team, take it away.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Rogers Ayiko, a senior specialist with the World Bank in Uganda Country Office. I am presenting a topic on linking public spending on health to human capital development, which is a special topic for the 23rd Uganda Economic Update. And this presentation tries to answer the question, is public spending on health in Uganda adequate, effective, efficient, and equitable? And this is being inspired by Uganda's renewed effort in strengthening human capital development for growth, and also informed by two special studies over the past 2 years. That is the Public Expenditure Review and Uganda Human Capital Development and Review. Now, investing in health is critical for human capital development and growth of nations. Health and nutrition are key components of the Human Capital Index, which is a measure of the future productivity of a country. Uganda's Human Capital Index is 38%, meaning that there is lost 62% of Uganda's productivity, and this loss is arising from a 5% gap in the proportion of children surviving up to the age of 5, a 24% gap in the proportion of children under 5 who are not stunted, a 26% gap in proportion of 15-year-olds not surviving up to the age of 60, and also 70% gap in learning adjusted years. As we know it, 1 extra year of life expectancy raises GDP by 4% and foreign direct investment by 9%. 1 centimeter increase in height is associated with 4 to 6% increase in wages among men and women. And health and nutrition basically affects everything else in our life. Now we are seeing demographic pressures, changing disease burden, and prevalent public health emergencies, increasing pressure on the health system in Uganda. By 2040, we expect Uganda's population to reach 70 million. And most of this will be working age population between 15 and 64 years, and less of children under the age of 15. Now this will come with the need for more service delivery capacity, in fact doubling of the existing infrastructure, but also the need to tap into Uganda's demographic dividend, such that those who are children today really grow into adulthood when they have capacity to be productive. We are also seeing the rising burden of non-communicable diseases. For example, over a decade's period, the proportion of deaths in our health facilities due to non-communicable diseases tripled from 8% to 24%. And yet NCDs are more complicated and expensive to treat. Uganda is also one of the most prone countries when it comes to public health emergencies, but fortunately the systems are fairly developed, yet they continue to cause scars in the health system. Uganda registered notable progress in universal health coverage, which is UHCI index, between 2000 and 2021, with the weakest link being the health service delivery capacity. There was a 27% increase. In fact, Uganda was one of the best performing countries among the peers in the region. But the problem is that the service delivery capacity remained very low. Because of the improved universal health coverage index, Uganda has performed better than peers in several key demographic and health indicators, although many registered little progress. Where most progress was registered related to maternal and child health, and this was due to specific policy focus over a period of about 20 to 25 years. We are seeing less progress in immunization, the proportion of children who receive all the basic immunization, and also teenage pregnancy and total fertility rate. Public spending on health in Uganda is inadequate, but good enough. It's relatively effective and equitable. Uganda lags on public spending on health, constraining progress in health outcomes and human capital development. For example, our spending on health from public sources is 40% less of what is recommended for low-income countries. In fact, we also spend only 3.9% of our budget on health as opposed to the Abuja target of 15%. Even when we add external sources which are on budget, it only reaches about half of that. Part of the reduction in total public spending on health is because of the progressive reduction in domestic allocation to health. from 6.5% of the total government expenditure in 2014-15 to 3.9% in 2020-2021. In fact, the other graph shows that Uganda's GDP per capita from domestic sources is one of the lowest. It's just at 6.8 US dollars. There is over-reliance on external financing and regressive out-of-pocket expenditure, which makes the health financing system exposed to uncertainties and risks. Over the period 2014 to 2021, 47% of Uganda's spending on health came from external sources, 37% came from households as out-of-pocket, and only 15% came from domestic resources. With 84% of Uganda's spending on health coming from external sources and out-of-pocket, Uganda's health financing system can be considered to be unsustainable. The good thing is that allocation of health spending in Uganda is aligned to the disease burden, but rather skewed towards curative and higher levels of care. We spend less than 30% of the healthcare resources on preventive care, while about 60% is on curative care. And most of this money goes to malaria, non-communicable diseases, and HIV/AIDS, which are the leading causes of burden of disease. Uganda is relatively better at translating health spending into health services and outcomes. For example, we see with the Universal Health Coverage Index of 49%, Uganda's coverage index is similar to that of Senegal, Rwanda, and even closer to Kenya, which spend much more money per capita on health. The good thing is that Uganda's outcomes, especially maternal mortality, is one of the best in the region, even with the lower health spending per capita. Public health centers in Uganda are largely equitable across wealth groups, meaning that the poor and the rich benefit almost equally, except in the year 2019-2020, when the benefit of public health centers going to the rich reduced significantly. But we've seen over the years between 2012 and 2020, the public hospitals have been pro-rich, meaning that there's a gap in delivering hospital-like services for the poor, and this needs to be addressed. Ugandans are protected from financial hardships, but a high number of households are still affected, stifling poverty eradication efforts. In 2019-2020, about 12% of households, that is close to 5 million people, incurred catastrophic spending on health. That is to say, spending more than 10% of their income on health. And half of this spending was due to the cost of medicines. The 10% may look a smaller rate, but the problem is healthcare spending comes with uncertainties of when you need it, and it leads to people losing and selling off their hard-earned assets. We also have about 1 million people who get pushed into poverty due to spending on health. And this basically dilutes the government's effort of trying to get people out of poverty. Consequences of public health spending inadequacies on health and human capital service delivery abound. For example, the General Service Readiness Index, the readiness of health facilities to deliver health services in Uganda is just under 60%. And the lowest performance is among primary health care facilities. And probably that is why people end up overloading the referral facilities. Of course, this affects the quality of services, but also leads to absence of those services where people need them. Public health spending challenges are also reflected in health workforce shortages, maldistribution, and low productivity. Uganda recently changed its health workforce norms or standards, in which only 32% of those required positions have been filled. And there's maldistribution of staff, in that there are some regions which have almost twice the average of public health staff, and also some urban areas more overrepresented with health workers. There's suboptimal competency and productivity of health workforce, and also spending on health workforce in Uganda, while it has improved over the recent past and now is similar to that of peer countries, may create some challenges with trying to address the huge staffing gap. Persistent stock out of essential medicines is mainly due to inadequate spending on health, on medicines, and also weaknesses in supply chain. For example, in 2020-2021, Uganda only spent $3.2 per person on medicine, and this is about 4 times less than what is recommended for low-income countries. And this could partly explain why less than 50% of facilities had over 95% availability of tracer commodities. And this is despite the recent nominal increase in allocations for medicines. Now, we offer a number of recommendations to address some of these challenges. One is to strengthen the health financing system through a number of ways, e.g., positive reprioritization of domestic spending on health, to address urgent staffing, medicine infrastructure shortfalls, mitigate uncertainties around external financing, and reduce financial burden on households. There is also need to strengthen alignment of donor funding to government priorities and resource tracking, and then also strengthening strategic purchasing through results-based financing, which has been largely successful in the health sector, but also progressive implementation of the proposed national insurance scheme. There's need for progressive strengthening of the resource allocation formula so that all the other healthcare resources and inputs are equitably served across the country. There's need to strengthen public investment management and public financial management. The second recommendation is focusing investments on primary health care, health promotion, and disease prevention, whereby there should be focus on strengthening the functionality of existing facilities and carefully rolling out specialized care so that they do not get out of hand, too many and difficult to manage in terms of costs. Thirdly, there's a need to strengthen public-private partnerships and collaboration for health, not just in the traditional health service delivery, but also in terms of auxiliary services like energy, wash, and digital services. So there's a need to develop new and update existing performance agreements. There's need to forcefully improve the availability and productivity of health workforce by increasing wage allocation, strengthening health worker recruitment, and scaling up performance contracting, improving quality of healthcare training through competence-based training, streamlining in-service training, and also regulation of health training institutions, and strengthening health workforce information system and payroll management. Fifthly, there's need to increase access to efficacious and affordable medicines and health technologies, and this would require increase in allocation for essential medicines, but also strengthening the medicine supply chain system, especially using interoperable digital solutions. Last but not least, there's need to improve healthcare service quality through scaling up quality improvement interventions in all health facilities, and also strengthening client engagement and feedback mechanisms. We believe with these 6 recommendations, it's possible to achieve a more sustainable, equitable, effective, and adequate health financing system that can contribute towards optimizing human capital outcomes and economic growth potential of Uganda. I thank you for your attention.
Rogers, thank you very much for that comprehensive breakdown. I have a special passion for health. So when it comes to health, I pay close attention. Rogers, while you were making that presentation, thank you. So I happen to cover so many health stories. I covered a story about cancer. Any of us in this room, I don't know if you've had a patient who got cancer and how it is very difficult to manage such a patient. Cancer equalizes the rich and the poor, but to be at the same level. And access to treatment, I covered this story about, a family that was a bit well off, and then a cancer patient who came from Soroti to get treatment. and they all had to come to the Cancer Institute. That's where it all comes down to. Now, if you've been at the Cancer Institute, you really know what it means to have a patient there. There are people who spend nights outside for them to get their chemo. They cannot afford to go back, but they have to be there. The medical teams at the Cancer Institute work, I think, about 20 hours a day. I had an opportunity of speaking with Dr. Riem. Any of you who has spoken to him know that the oncologists there work literally every single day. For them, it's more of a service. But we also know that the medical care has been subsidized by government. The fact that people can go and get chemo and get radiotherapy and have access to expensive medicine that government has subsidized is a pat on the back to the government. But we also know the challenges that the patients go through, that they have to travel from all across the country to come to the Cancer Institute. I had good news that government is planning to open up centers of excellence of cancer care in the different regions. I don't know where that is at. So the cost of having medical care in this country takes center stage. And while you were speaking all these numbers and all the data here, I just wanted to paint a face, put a face to what the numbers here speak about access to healthcare. Many of us in this room have medical insurance. How many of you are insured? Medical insurance, anyone? You get sick, pull out your card, go to hospital. Mukami, you have, oh, I thought the country manager is not insured, the World Bank. So many of us in this room really have medical insurance. We get sick. It's, hey, so and so, you take to the hospital. Just get out insurance card. Under whose name? Solomon Seran, just, they get treatment and get out. So because we have that medical insurance cover, we perhaps may not understand what it means to get out of pocket. But the day that medical cover gets off, that you have to go to hospital and do a treatment, and you go for scanning, CT scan, then you go to this, and at every stage you have to pay money. You go and, MRI, how much is it? MRI? About 700. From there, you go and do these rare blood tests, and you have to spend out of pockets. Rogers' presentation comes alive. So let's take a deep dive into this. Rogers, karibu sana, please come and take your seat. We'll be asking some of those things that you presented to us. But we also are privileged to be having Richard Kabagambe here, my very good friend, as Assistant Commissioner Health Services Planning at the Ministry of Health. You're very welcome, Mr. Kabagambe, and Professor Fred Sengova, who is an Associate Professor, Health Economics and Health Systems Management at Makerere University there. I really would love to go directly into the discussion here. A number of things have come up, but yeah, I just wanted to get it from you, Rogers. You've certainly mentioned that there are some things that we've really done well. We've made progress. We've made progress, significant progress. And to quote your statement, you said both the poor and the rich. I wrote it somewhere. You mentioned that both the poor and the rich can at least have access to medical care. Rogers, what is it that we have? What is it that government has done well, and where have we missed it? Rogers, let me just start with you. Karibu.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much, Solomon and colleagues in the room here. When you get out to seek health services in this country, or when you read newspapers or listen to radios, you hear a lot of challenges. And we have been able to, through the process of the Public Expenditure Review and the Uganda Human Capital Development and Growth Review that informed this presentation, have been able to really take a deep dive into how our health system is performing vis-a-vis the ones of our peer countries. So we were actually pleasantly surprised that while everything looks a bit bad, there are so many good things that have happened. And that is why you could see that Uganda's Universal Health Coverage Index, which basically measures how well a country's health system is performing across about 4 dimensions. That is the health system's capacity, management of infectious diseases, management of non-communicable diseases, and also maternal and child health conditions, is one of the best in this region. I think this kind of finding, we didn't know it before. We were also shocked that after the release of the 7th Demographic Health Survey report this year, that Uganda's maternal and child health indicators improved drastically. Can you imagine that our maternal mortality ratio is under 200? It's actually 189 per 100,000 live births. And many countries in this region, probably whose GDP is 50% more than Uganda's, are at about 200, 300. So we want to thank all the actors led by government in this. And one of the reasons we believe these results are happening is because of policy actions that have been taken. And these policy actions are not those that were taken today or yesterday, but some many years ago. One of them is that we probably have the most robust decentralized service delivery system for health services in this region. Other countries are still learning how to do this. Although along the way, our funding allocation for decentralized service delivery actually got eroded. And that is why now it is being addressed through the intergovernmental fiscal transfers reform. And we hope that will be reversed and we will get back to the top. Second issue is the free healthcare policy. You know, in Uganda, it doesn't matter whether you are a baby or an older person or a youth. You go to a health facility, nobody is supposed to ask you for money. Of course, we know there's under the table asking of money. But when you look at it from the perspective of other countries in Uganda's similar situation, they would say free health services is only for this subpopulation, maybe children under 5 or only pregnant mothers. But ours is everybody. And that partly explains why our health services are largely equitable. There's actually no difference between poor people and rich people, especially in primary healthcare services. The only bit of challenge we have is hospitals, which are fewer, and they are too far from people. And that's where the richer benefit more. So that is very, very important. And of course, the focus on primary healthcare has been good. We need to invest more on disease prevention. There's been a lot of talk that we need to go that way, but we are still spending less than a third of the healthcare resources in that regard. So we need to actually jump that. Just to cap it, Uganda is actually, would say, a lab of innovations in terms of reforms in the health sector. As we speak right now, I think we are probably the first country or among 2 countries in the whole of Africa that have been able to implement results-based financing in the health sector across the country. I mean, many countries do it as a pilot, but we are doing it across the country, also supported under UGIFT partly, because in a previous project we witnessed a 10 to 20% better performance in facilities and districts that were actually participating in RBF, results-based financing. And also another reform, what we call direct facility financing, which means that funds are sent directly from the treasury to each of the facilities because they know their specific problems they need to deal with. And this has been able to help them to keep afloat. Many countries, about 15, 20 years down the road in Africa, now this is being sold around as a key innovation that many countries are picking. But Uganda did it many years ago. So I think I would also finally want to say that these policy reforms have been informed by a lot of data-driven direction of decisions. In fact, Uganda is one of the only countries in this region where you can make a policy instrument using data from the routine health information system. In many other countries, they don't trust it. They have not built the health information system. So these policies come, they're actually data-driven and they're focused to the highest priority problems that we are facing. So I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. I saw Richard nodding all throughout your presentation, all through your answering. Richard was saying, Richard, I'm sure today it's all flowers for you, and I think we should give them openly to government and the Ministry of Health for really these indicators that the World Bank is presenting to us. In your view, how have you been able to nail this at both policy level and implementation level?
No, thank you. But I think figures don't tell lies. So people outside there may not believe what the bank is presenting now. Because as you started from, if you go to the Cancer Institute, you may not think this is happening. But this is not happening by mistake or by accident. It has been a deliberate move by government to put in place critical investments that we are now reaping on. And one of them is actually the policy reforms, as Roger said. We've been able to invest more resource in primary health care, disease prevention, and health promotion. From the basic angle, we end up solving 70% of the health problems at the household level. And also information has been going out to our population that if you do X and Y, you are able to avoid this. But also have had strategic investment areas that we have been supported by the donors. And particularly if maybe the World Bank can bail us out on this. We invested heavily in health center series under the U-Gift project, which manifests this, because we no longer see a lot of patients moving to the hospitals. We are able to sort them out down there. And this investment actually was strategic in the sense that when we are putting up Health Center 3, we're also providing accommodation for medical staff. So people are there all the time. Now, government also, as you're aware, invested heavily in the enhancement of health workers' wages. Yes, there are some gray areas there. People are asking, is it an incentive or has it caused the problem? Because we are also seeing absenteeism despite them earning more. They are earning more, but they're absent. So why? And some of the problems may be beyond this room. But at least you are sure out of 18 people in the facility, you'll find 70% present. Now, lastly, I think we have also been able to allocate efficiently some of the resources in the sector to key areas that give us these outcome indicators. Mostly is the allocation of resources into ICUs, blood banks, ambulance services, and also oxygen plants. So we used to have issues in the lower facilities on oxygen, run out of oxygen, but also medicines. For example, next financial year, we have an additional of over 100 billion to essential medicines, to NMS. So we cannot solve all these problems at a go, but we can see progressively we are trying to close the gaps that have been prevailing. And the only challenge we still have is fragmentation of our donor support. Most of the resources that come into the sector, yes, they are registered here, but most of them are off budget. And we have issues there. We are
Say again, they are?
off budget.
What do you mean?
They are not coming into the government system budget support. Okay? So apart from the World Bank that is supporting us in terms of budget, These other players that are off budget, we are still playing it rough because we are unable to track what these resources do. There is a lot of inefficiency, duplication, but we are also engaging them as health development partners to come on board. So, and slowly by slowly we are seeing some progress, but not quite good for us to move the way we wanted.
Wow, interesting. Thank you. And I think Rogers mentioned it in his report about the external funding of the health budget, but we'll speak to that just shortly. Professor Fred Sengoba, strategic economic investment, strategic health economic investment. I was fascinated by what government did with quality chemicals. WHO certified level 3 state-of-the-art facility. I had an opportunity of visiting it. Was out of collaboration. We're now able to, I think they already paid, Mr. Kabagambe, I think did they pay government entirely? Quality chemicals. I know that, yes, they did. Yeah, they did pay. Yeah. I mean, think about that. We can produce our ARVs, we can produce our anti-malarials, and we can as well sell to neighboring countries. It was strategic investment, and it really helped quite very well in terms of access to medicines. But yeah, Professor, good. This is encouraging. I'm happy, Rogers. You've put a smile on my face, hearing these statistics and these numbers. What comes to your mind when you hear these figures, Professor, in terms of where, how have we been able to be this far, to go this far? Yes.
Well, thank you. And first of all, allow me to congratulate the World Bank for the new home and for this report, and of course for this opportunity for us to dialogue. I think it shows we are all maturing as institutions to support development here. So we are very proud to see this development. Thank you. So to the question you raised, and thank you for asking about quality chemicals. Back then, I think it was 2009, December, at the verge of Obama coming into America as president and Bush leaving. Remember, Bush had started PEPFAR. And PEPFAR was one of the human capital investment that has happened around our region in terms of HIV. Those of you who are here in the 80s, 90s, we were all projecting a lot of people literally dying, and the whole country was looking at a basket case. This is a word of one of the decorated economists at the time. So we saw this investment coming in and changing the whole discourse of HIV, and we've seen how that has transformed the human capital development issue we are discussing about. So when Obama was coming, there was an issue that the first PEPFAR program was closing. And we shall only continue from that point on with those who are now in the program. And those who are outside, remember this is 2009. Those outside, sorry, we can't take you on because the money is going to be a lot. The costs were high. So, remember reaching out to one of the journalists and one of those who work very close with the journalists. And we also had a small paper here in New Vision which went across. But the point was this, that we have this program is coming in. It's very costly. And we are not sure this is going to actually be sufficient to deliver the rest of the people who haven't yet got on board. So at that time, Gambe here and some other colleagues who are in the Ministry of Health, Dr. Runumi in particular, we went into discussion. So they asked me to write a letter to the editor. That letter was a surprise letter to learn that government was actually negotiating to do local manufacturing. And HIV drugs were the main issue. If it's going to close because the US is not able to support, the government started thinking of how do we provide this for our country. And I think it was a smart policy decision. I remember the initial money was given quality chemicals, and before long we started, initially imported, started manufacturing. And now it's a big company. And as you said, accredited by WHO. So this is another element of policies that are done in particular situation in time, and over time they pay off. It also helps me to make the point I wanted to make from these indices. The investments that have gone in to make these new changes that we're just starting to see in the last 10 to 5 years, I mean in terms of UDHS, the policies have actually been on the ground for some time. And the element of how much time we have to wait to see development, for me, is the biggest challenge I have. My friend Uganda, and I'm sure Joseph, will tell you the budget, they are now calling it performance-based. You have to indicate the indicator you are improving, and you have to put the money. Now, for some of us, you invest now, the outcome is 20 years. How do we get into this game of now the budget has to be performance-based, and people are struggling, I don't know how you're doing it, to try to justify that their actions today can pay off by the end of the budget, and they ensure that they've performed. That is one thing I wanted to first raise here, but also to celebrate, that unless we are patient to invest in this human capital, if you're going to train somebody today, is in nursery school, you're going to feed the child before he's born, the brain grows almost 70% in pregnancy. So if you want to have a good brain, don't wait until the child is born. Feed the mother so that the mother feeds the baby. How do we start measuring these issues that are coming even at conception, eventually into somebody becoming a professor like me or commissioner? It is something that we really need to reflect carefully on. So is sustainable development, sustainable financing is important. But let me go back to the point you raised, which is also very critical to where we are now. Those of you who remember COVID pandemic. Previously, the government was, everything is being done in China. Why do we invest in the same area here? But I think we started seeing how, even when the vaccine came out, people started saying, look, Europe was negotiating with the Serum Institute in India, and they would take away the whole production for the whole year because Europe is big. By the time they started serving Uganda, it was too late. If we didn't have donors, partners to give us their vaccines out there that were about to expire, we would not have gotten enough vaccination in time. Actually, those of you who know, ours came, the one we paid for, and most of us had been vaccinated, and the rest of the story you know. But the point I wanted to make is that we really need to think about how are we investing in whether it is pharmaceutical industries, whether it is health centers, whether it is the midwife services that need to be set up where they are not, are in time, and over time, how do we nurture them? Nurturing them so that with time, they can sustain. I want to celebrate the same indicators that some of them are double-dicked. Frankly, I didn't know that in my lifetime, Uganda will get some of these developments, especially maternal mortality, child survival indicators. They've improved, even family planning. It used to be very slow, yes. It has moved quite substantially. And the question I think that was asked, what are the interventions? And the reason I want to spend a few 1 or 2 minutes about the intervention, that sometimes finance and the investors and human capital interested parties, sometimes they don't pay too much attention to what does it take to get this. I've already talked about time. It doesn't come overnight. The second bit is that I remember we had, during Chiyonga's time, started health center 4s. Those were started to do cesarean section. And the idea was, during the 90s when he was Minister of Health, is that then most maternal mortality will reduce and we don't have to depend on TBS. But of course, big internationals came and said, TBS are the best, first invest. That one is going to take too long. So it took us almost 15 years before functionalizing health center 4s. If you look over the years, those 20 years, Ministry of Health reports, you will find that functionalizing them was a big task. Many times they were about 30, 40. When they get to 60, then the doctors leave and then it drops. Then the theater doesn't work. Then the theater is fixed. Then there's no equipment. So we went through, but now they are all starting to flourish. The doctors are there, the equipment is there, and now the mother can go there and get delivery. Of course, we've delayed, and this is the big challenge I want to indicate. When we invest and say, let's first take health center force throughout the country, and we build for 5 years, we equip for another 5 years, we bring human resource for another 5 years, 15 years, we are not yet putting together a package. We are still putting item, layering them. But if at that time Chiyonga raised this, we had 5 that financial year, fully equipped, ready to go. And the next 5 years, another 5. By now, these indicators will have come long ago. That's what I'm trying to raise. So the point I'm trying to say is that I'm glad we are making progress. Sometimes we are delayed. Some of us are impatient. We would like to see these things happen faster. But also how do we then go into, how do we invest in this? Can we do a package investment at a time rather than equity-based? Every MP wants to see a building first. Then eventually let's put the theater bed all over. Then let's put a midwife. By the time we finish, all of the other things are breaking down. You've seen this. Some of the theaters were, by the time the doctors came, the ceiling was falling in and now repairing. So I think that is one thing, but otherwise I want to also congratulate the ministry, but I also want to congratulate our partners. I think the partnerships that deliver this has not been, as said a lot. Sometimes we complain about they are off budget, but the first thing is, if we did not count carefully the amount of money that is coming in outside government is putting in, we will not be here. Yeah. Over the years, government has really been hovering around 10-15% of what actually it takes to deliver health care in this country every year. So, but who is lifting the other load? It is really the people in there out of pocket, but importantly, the donors. Yeah. So we really needed to also think about how is government going forward nurturing these donors, relations, these partnerships, so that, because if Gavi wasn't there, could we get the immunization we have now? The global funds, the papers, and there are many, I can't mention all of them. You said. Yes, but of course, I hear the prayer of the ministry and government. Can they put their resources in the pot so that we can see what it's doing? Because what you asked off budget, if I get the money from wherever it's coming from, I own my own building like here. You see fleets of cars going all over the district. You may not know how much is fleet, how much is the salary here, how much is service there. Sometimes things are a little loop-sided. You may find the services is the little, the administration is the biggest. And I think that's what you're trying to explain. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you. While you're speaking, I'm reminded of the Partnership for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing, PAVAM. Of course, we know that government of Uganda sent its signature on the 2040 target of manufacturing our own vaccines by 2040. And the race is already on. I just saw when you talked about, are we patient enough to invest now and expect results tomorrow? I mean, I know that government is pumping money into vaccine manufacturing. Well, they called it pathogenic economy. The private sector has really been convincing government to give it money to support it in its vaccine manufacturing plant, which perhaps may pay off if another pandemic hits and we don't have to wait for the big pharma in Europe to produce and to satisfy the European market until when we get vaccines. Many of us don't have that patience, though. We start to question what is the return on investment of $100 billion or 100 billion in a private firm. You know, why don't we just do it? But yeah, interesting. Gentlemen, I just wanted us to just engage the gear and talk about what I think Rogers was arguing, that there is the investment in the health sector is not sufficient enough. And he also raised an aspect that, you know, we're getting a lot of, the health sector is largely supported by external funding. And Professor, you talked about the PEPFAR incident. I remember covering that story at that time. But Rogers, what did you mean by that? Perhaps let's start there.
Yeah, okay. I think it's good that we started with the good story. And it's actually surprising to everybody. I mean, some of these reports, when the leadership of the Ministry of Health saw from the demographic and health survey, they were all surprised. And the team went to look at the whole data set and the processes, and they still came up with the same kind of findings. But we're actually seeing some other countries like Tanzania also posting quite good results, meaning the whole region might be moving in the right direction. So in terms of saying that the funding is inadequate, it is because, for example, for us to achieve universal health coverage, that is meaning that everybody is able to get the services they need at the right quality, at the right time, whenever they need it. And also they get it with some kind of financial risk protection, that they don't have to pay off to forego treatment because they do not have money in the pocket. So there are some international standards, of course from experience, which saw that a low-income country and low-middle-income countries need to spend about $86 per person to be able to achieve this universal health coverage, which we are now at about 49%. For us to go towards 100, we need about $86 per capita. And when we consider time value of money, this is almost around 112 now. That 86 was about 8 years ago. So our spending is $50. So you can imagine it's half of what is required. Now, what is also important to note that this $50 is 84% coming from partners and also out of pocket. Now, the problem with partner funding is not very regular, meaning it's difficult to do long-term planning based on it. And also, as Uganda transitions into the real middle-income space, partner funding is going to drop. That one we have known from experience of other countries. And that is why we are sounding the alarm bell, that the country needs to progressively start taking up that gap that is going to be created. I know some countries actually failed to immunize their children when abruptly Gavi funds and so on were dropped. So also from experience, countries that spend more of their own domestic resources actually have faster progress towards universal health coverage index. Because what you have in your hand, you are able to plan it and direct it better than relying on something which is also decided upon by other people. So that is where the shortfall is. Now, the other part of the shortfall, which maybe Joseph can help us probably digest further, is the fact that about 1 million Ugandans fall into poverty because of spending on health. I had asked this question before to colleagues at Ministry of Finance, but I didn't get the response. When you combine all the poverty eradication interventions, how many Ugandans are actually brought out of poverty per year? Now, if the number is 2 million, just know half of them will go back to poverty because of health care. And as I indicated in the presentation, while this spending on health care, somebody may equate it to spending on other consumer goods. The problem with the health is that it is a bit a different type of product or service, whereby there is a very, very big difference in terms of information asymmetry between those seeking services, those providing services. Even among those that are providing services, there's a lot of differences in level of knowledge, meaning that it's difficult to coordinate everything and get the wholesome benefit out of it. And also it comes at any time T. You talked about somebody of yours at the Cancer Institute. I have actually lost about 3 friends at the Cancer Institute. And this is because of the rising burden of non-communicable diseases. Now I'm trying to answer the issue of shortage of money in another way. When I was a medical doctor, I graduated in 2006. 2007-8, I was able to see 170 patients per day in the OPD. And of course, I would send away about 50 because it was just not possible to cover all of them in the day. But then, the health conditions we are dealing with were more straightforward. I mean, somebody comes with fever, and that is malaria. You sort it in 1 minute. Right now, somebody comes into your house as a patient is actually representing about 15 other patients in themselves because of different forms of complications packed in one person. So health workers are no longer able to be able to deal with huge numbers of patients, especially with our growing population, if we do not cover the gap of the health workforce requirement. I indicated on our current standards, the coverage field positions is 32%. So we need to work on it, but we always have challenges with wage allocation. If we do not do wage allocations properly, that means we are not strengthening our health system to respond to these peculiar needs of the health sector. Now, people are becoming much older. That means more complex conditions are coming. But also, we are seeing more frequent public health emergencies. Do you know during the Ebola, the COVID time? I mean, everybody was scared about COVID. But Uganda was dealing with about 14 other emergencies across the country. Just imagine the effect of these outbreaks that happen on the health system. It keeps weakening the health system. So we need to be able to raise especially public domestic spending to health, one, to address the increased burden of complex conditions which need more monies, and even they need to be treated over long term. Not like malaria, within 3 days somebody is gone. You need to treat for 20 years. And also the public health emergencies that are becoming more prevalent. But above all, with our rapid growing population, we will expect to actually double our health infrastructure. So if we continue with budgeting for health in the traditional way, 10 years down the road, these results we are seeing now will actually drop, and it will take another 10, 20 years to bring them up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Especially as we're getting into the middle income state. You scared me. Because you mentioned that you've learned from other countries, the moment they step into middle income, then, external funding reduces from donors, and because anyway, you can be able to foot part of your budget. But thanks, Rogers. We'll take 2 minutes each, and then I can open it up to the audience. What should we do about the issues that Rogers has mentioned, Mr. Kabagambi?
I think the issues is raising are very patent, and the government has to get interested. Because if you look at the way our budget is structured, whereas we have got about 4-fold increment in health for the last 10 years, the structure of this budget is challenging. For example, more than 69% goes into wages. So you remain with very little money to do investments. Actually, only 6% is for development, domestic development. So we are relying heavily on our partners in terms of infrastructure, equipment, medicines. It will be actually a shock if now Global Fund or Gavi says, in the next 2 years we are not able to support you, we would get more problems and lose all these outcome indicators we have registered. So it is very important for government to look at it seriously. And as we transition into the middle income status, we should also be transitioning into being self-sustaining and reliant. But nevertheless, I think there's also some things we need to do with the little we have. Yeah, as government, we still have a lot of leakages and wastages in the system. If we can address those ones, maybe we can have some little money we can channel or save. And much of them are actually in terms of medicines, We have expiries in some places, shortages. We have still corruption in the system, but we also, like absenteeism, we are paying somebody who is not working. That is also a wastage. And we are paying heavily. And recently, when they advertised for health workers in the regional referrals, most people in the private sector were applying. They want to shift from the private sector to the public sector. But will they leave? Because we don't have a policy stopping dual employment. So he will work in Mulago, but he will also remain in his own clinic or somewhere else. And those also suffocate, of course, the whole system. But by and large, I think we have also learned a lot with our partners. There are some things we can do together to improve the way we are spending these resources. Like the RBF, the result-based financing. I remember when Kenneth was still at finance, for us we thought it won't work. And he insisted. We said it won't work. But we are seeing results. We are seeing results, and we have rolled it over to the lower facilities. People should be paid, should earn according to what they have produced. We have also recommended performance contracts to our health workers. But recommendation, it will be agreed or not, but it will also supposed to be supported. Now, the insurance issue, because that's also putting resources towards our system. And it's one way of pulling resources from the household. Because as well as we say that our health care is free, it's not. They go to these facilities, but they pay under the table. They are paying. So wanted to say, why can't we pick what they are paying indirectly into a pool and we adopt the health insurance scheme? It's still at a political level, but we can see some light at the end. Though we have also been warned that, of course, and we know the scheme is not a magic bullet. It may not solve all the problems we have. Those countries that are implementing it also have issues. Kenya, Ghana, and they are not moving as expected. But by and large, we should also appreciate that government has been prioritizing the human capital program. For example, next financial year, we are on top. We have like 14% of the national budget allocations. We are number one. We are followed by governance and security with 13%. Then the infrastructure will be 7%. So our hope is that if there is growth of the economy to 6.2 or 7%, and there's also oil revenue coming in, the physical space will also be relaxed a bit, and we should also be able to tap more resources to fix some of the gaps we have.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, especially if the money also is going beyond wages. I mean, I was taken aback when you said 69% of the budget for the Ministry of Health goes into wages. Wow. All right, thanks, Richard Kabagambe. Professor Fred Sengova, what can we do?
What can we do? Thank you. Having listened to the first panel, I wasn't very sure how this question can be answered, especially if you see that high up, the sources of revenue, the expansion of that is still quite a challenge. And as we had, ways to grow it are still not very clear. And we see our neighbors are also struggling with the same issue. So it's important, of course, for us in public health to continue to ask government to think of the obligation around health, education, social security, nutrition, all of these sectors that are bundled together into what we call human capital. because it is within that sector that we have the nation's best asset. And I think was said the session before, the best asset for any country is people. And if you want to develop, definitely the first asset to polish up is your people. And the health, those of you who follow football, I always use the football example. I support Arsenal. But when our star strikers get injured and they are off for 6 weeks, everybody is like, oh my God, how are we going to navigate? Because all of a sudden, health has befallen a big asset of this football club. But I think we also need to think of it as a country where now people are constantly having malaria, and malaria is here, and some people think it should stay because it is the one that was able to, I remember one of the politicians said, it helped save us from being taken over by the white. So we should keep it so that it's going to be a protector. I think we are not being serious, but the point here is, how can we tolerate some of these recurrent health conditions that take away a big number of people from work? Malaria, ideally, is something we could be able to do away with. We've demonstrated it over and over that we can do away with it, but somehow we haven't sustained these efforts. And that brings me to something that the government and the Ministry of Health has taken seriously. I think the whole idea of how do we put money into health prevention and promotion programs has now taken a very big perspective in the ministry. I know there is even a new department. There's been a whole restructuring, and now they are trying to get these programs to community health. I think this is a positive move, but we really need to see monies going there. I think that is the next step. So if we can be able to deal with many of these conditions, many of them we can prevent, I must say. Many of the NECDs, of course, is a lifestyle issue. We really needed to see how to appeal to the people who are going through school, the corporates, the way we feed, the way we celebrate. Some of these things, we can actually reduce them markedly. It is always difficult when you are trying to grow economically, and people think that means having more leisure, more food to eat. Every time I go to a party, I see the kind of food, 15 different carbohydrates, and everyone wants to pick each of them. At the end of the day, they are eating one thing, carbohydrates, but eating it in like 9 different variations. That is an indication that even we at the corporate level have not yet understood what we are supposed to be doing. So how do we change that, but also how do we, the community help them? And the other element that I think we can still do better of is vaccination. I think I'm glad that we've had introduced now about, is it 13 different vaccines? And I think this is one of those. I remember we used to have a lot of diarrhea conditions in the health facility. Children coming and you see, they are dehydrated, dying from there. Now, because of vaccines, that has reduced markedly over 60%. And so we really needed to continue to look at the vaccination agenda and how government is putting money there. The challenge, of course, for my colleague, these are also becoming very expensive. The malaria vaccine is coming. Currently, it takes us about $44 to $50 to immunize a child with these 13. But when malaria comes, it might almost become double, because malaria wants to almost give $4 to $5. Doses, and each dose is almost 4 plus a company. Meaning that we also need to carefully look at how we are absorbing new intervention, new vaccines. Otherwise, we may then fail the whole basket if we start putting an expensive one and then the rest become less. So we really need to manage that, but it's a very important program we need to sustain. I think it's been talked about as RBF, how we actually put money into maternal health and pay for results, particularly is transformative. But we also need to agree with my colleagues what is transformative in there. World Bank has helped us with a big loan for loan and grant mix for almost 5-6 years, and we've done wonders with this program. But it was giving 70% of the monies were actually, if you look at PHC grant, the money that does support the health facility to do what it does, this grant was almost giving 70% of it. Now it is gone, or it's almost. How are we filling that gap? I don't know if you get what I'm trying to say. We really need to figure out, when we get these facilities, how do we support them adequately? And I'm glad there's been a huge gift, which is another way to take more money to the front line. We have decentralization, yes, but how do we get those people at the front line there, supported, finance to deliver? Currently, I think the local governments will tell you that they would actually do wonders on these indicators if we are able to invest a little more than we are currently doing. And the population management, we can't succeed with these numbers of growth, although we've been told that this is a place gifted by nature. You know, it is the way we're advertising for hospitality and tourism, but it also comes in the way we reproduce. There are so many children coming on board. Now we have almost coming to 1.5 million newborns.
Every year.
Every year. And that means we are going to, whatever increase that they are likely to give us is not going to be sufficient. Very soon we'll hit 2 million. Until the projection you've modeled here, I'm not sure whether it will be realized, where that becomes less. But the point I'm raising is that in the next 5-10 years, we are going to have more children coming on board. And remember, that was also about pregnancies, about maternal, about education. All of those have to enter these systems, and we need to put money into them. If we have to train them, feed them well, the whole human capital investment around the first 5 years of age is going to grow, it's not going to reduce. So we really need to put more money or plan about controlling the population.
Family planning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fred Sengova. Can we love on my panelists with a round of applause? Thank you very much. To invite Mukami to come back and give us closing remarks. You're very welcome, Mukami. We'll be the photo. Let's have it after Mukami's closing remarks. You're very welcome, ma'am. Come and give us a closing remarks.
Thank you. So I'll be brief because I think we've had a very rich but well-rounded discussion today. So no need to really belabor the points. And I'll really try and focus just a little bit on the latter part of the discussion, because I think the former part is something that's a continuing part of our UEUs, but the latter part, which is the health focus, is something that will change in every Uganda economic update. So yes, I think the momentum of the economy is going in the right direction. Sustaining it is going to be critical. I think we've heard the elements of what needs to be done there. And I think we've also heard the importance of ensuring that the health sector financing aspects are also taken into consideration as part of the budgeting process. So a big takeaway, I think, is about sustainability, given the 84% that's coming from either households or from the external financing that's on the table today. So finding a way to make sure that we don't, at some point, find ourselves without either part and not having adequately taken into account the growing population, I think, was one message. A second message was about the results and performance basis for our health sector services. I think we're very happy to hear that the ministry has taken this up wholeheartedly, not just because of RBF, but also looking at performance contracts and other ways to incentivize service deliveries. Third point, I think, which was important, was trying to see whether it's a family planning option or it's an increase in expenditure to keep up with population growth, given the numbers we're hearing, the 1 million plus new children born every year, and the need to not start when they're born, but start before they're born to ensure that we get the human capital potential maximized. And then a fourth point I think there is that obviously human capital, we talked about it in the first part, being essential for economic growth. So, this topic, we've explored it in a very interesting discussion today. Health, most people don't see it really as being essential for the economy, but I think today it's come through much more clearly what needs to be done there on both sides, avoiding people falling into poverty, but also making sure that they have grown and been healthy enough to be able to contribute to the economy. And then lastly, I think the whole point about raising awareness of the good results and the good opportunities that government has created through the public health services that are available today, and trying to make sure that the sustainability of that good performance keeps people coming back to those public health facilities. So I'll say that I'll end on that note, just to say that these are some of the messages that came through in the second half, but we will continue to be there to have the discussions around the economic agenda with the Ministry of Finance, our key counterpart, to try and see what else needs to be adjusted going forward to make sure that we continue to sustain our support in ways that helps to build your own sustainability in the long term, so that we are out of the picture. As you reach middle income status, it will be less needed to keep those services going. So that is it, and let me hand back to Solomon to say goodbye, tell us what's next. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mukami Kariuki, World Bank Country Manager, Uganda, thank you very much for your time. Special thank you to the consultants who worked on this report.